Hi everyone, welcome to this talk on improving pressure simulation driven by immersed dynamic surfaces. I'm Marin Lauber from the University of Southampton, and this is work that has been done with Dr. Gabriel Weymouth. So what do we mean by immersed dynamic surfaces? Well, those are all the FSI systems that involve a very thin structure that is driving the flow. So you have example of this in insect flight with the insect wings, Arctic valve, fishtails, and sails. And the main characteristic of those systems is that pressure force are dominant on the structure. So you rely on this pressure force to generate lift or to prevent the flow to come back into your heart in Arctic valves. And depending on the dynamic of the system, you can also have quite substantial added mass force acting on your structure. So one way to solve those problems is the Cartesian grid method, where you solve the equation on the static background grid and you incorporate the influence of the solid by distributing an appropriate force onto this fluid field. So those methods have been around for some time. They were developed in the 70s to model the flow around heart valves. And since then, we have seen numerous variation or extension of the original method. And we can classify them in three basic categories. And these categories differ in the way the forcing is actually imposed. So if you reshape the cells that are actually cut by your fluid-solid interface, you have what's called the cut cell method. So those methods work pretty well because they are efficient at imposing the boundary condition. But once the structure starts to move a lot, you can have all sorts of instabilities due to cells disappearing or appearing. And it's actually also quite hard to calculate all the possible intersection between your interface and the cells. The second method provides this forcing via a reaction force from the solid onto the fluid. So this reaction force can be obtained from a constitutive law or a basic feedback type method. And finally, the last type of method are methods where you change what equation you're solving locally, whether you're in the fluid or the solid. And this is basically the idea between direct forcing or the boundary data immersion method. So basically, the idea between Cartesian grid method is to provide some kind of forcing, but what is this forcing actually doing? Well, it's aiming to impose the boundary condition. So the first boundary condition it's imposing is a no slip. And this is usually done pretty well to some order of accuracy, depending on the method. But this is something that is common to all immersed boundary method. The second boundary condition that has to be imposed is the normal pressure gradient onto the body. And this is where methods start to differ a lot by imposing or not imposing at all this boundary condition. And this is well known that for a fractional step method, not imposing this correct boundary condition can lead to a slip on the final velocity field. And for very, very thin structure, this slip can actually lead to flow through. And as we will see, this can very corrupt your pressure forces by quite a lot if you don't deal with the pressure boundary condition correctly. So how can we actually test all this? Well, the idea here was to build a very, very simple one-dimensional problem. So we can collapse a 3D pipe to a very simple 1D problem by connecting the pipe into a ring and assuming that the fluid it has no friction on the side of the pipe. So the fluid is inviscid and incompressible. And this collapsed to a 1D periodic problem with incompressible flow. And we can then place a piston inside this pipe and attach the piston to a spring or a mechanism to simply move this piston. So from a very simple continuity approach, we can clearly see that as soon as the piston will start to move, the flow will have to instantly match its velocity in order to satisfy continuity and mass conservation. So this flow has a very trivial solution that you can obtain from just first principle, but numerically it's much harder to solve it because of the fractional step method. So we know that the flow velocity must instantly match the piston velocity from continuity. But what is actually driving the flow to this velocity? Well, if we simply look at the 1D Navier-Stokes equation and start from a static fluid, we just have two terms that are remaining. And if we integrate this in time and use the initial condition, we see that the pressure gradient term is actually the term that drives the flow to the correct final velocity. That is actually the piston velocity. So if you solve this numerically, it means that in a single step, the pressure gradient term must recover when you solve for the pressure, you must recover the correct pressure field to drive the flow to the correct velocity. And this is very interesting because we now have a very, very simple problem that we can solve in 1D. And it's very simple. You can use very few grid points, periodic BC, so very simple to implement, a fractional step method for to solve the coupled system, and a very basic Jacobi solver for the pressure. So if you're interested to see the numerical implementation and the more details also about the numerical method, I invite you to go on my GitHub and check the Jupyter notebook that I put on there for this problem. So now the results. Well, if we compare a bunch of Cartesian grid methods, we see that there are a very, very big range of results. So some of them are performing extremely well, recovering the exact solution almost to the computer precision, while some other are just giving us basically rubbish. So what's the difference between those methods who are working very well and the methods that are not able to capture this, to solve this very, very simple problem? Well, it also all has to do with the pressure treatment during the fractional step method. So the correct boundary conditions are usually imposed on the provisional velocity field, but because the pressure field is then computed wrong, the slip velocity is introduced on the final velocity field. And this is because we do not impose any boundary condition on the pressure during the projection step. And for our simple case, this is fatal. You cannot recover the correct solution. So you can have a very, very simple heuristic argument about that. So why is this actually happening? Well, because the structure is very, very thin and you don't impose any boundary condition on the pressure. It's like the pressure solver is not seeing that there is actually a wall there and it cannot balance any mass across this wall. So this is for a simple 1D problem, but does this extend to more complex 3D problems, for example? And we'll see that it does actually. So if we take the case of an accelerated disk that is accelerated normal to its plane, we have a flow that has initially is only the force acting on this body is initially only added mass, and there is actually an analytical solution for this problem. And we will see that depending on the method you use and whether or not you impose the correct boundary condition on the pressure, you cannot recover the correct added mass force. And we will do this for different disk thicknesses. So in order to test the method. So now we are looking at the velocity profile around the axial velocity profile around the top edge of our disk that is accelerated. And for the methods that correctly impose the boundary condition, we see that for very, very thin bodies where you don't correctly discretize your mass function, you have some flow through that is allowed. And once you properly discretize the mass function or you change those mass function to work for any body thickness, you see that the flow through is completely stopped. And direct forcing method on the other end, where no boundary condition are imposed on the pressure, are allowing flow through for almost any body thicknesses. So we have method that fail to impose this no flow through condition and a method that impose it pretty well. And you might ask yourself, well, is this actually important for the forces we're calculating on this disk and especially the added mass force? And it turns out it is very important. So the direct forcing method completely misses the added mass force as well as when you don't properly discretize your mass function. But you can also see that you recover the correct behavior once a steady state is reached and the wake is allowed to evolve. And on the other end, once you properly discretize this pressure boundary condition, you recover the correct added mass term for any discretization and also the standard steady wake results. So now just some general remark and a small conclusion for this presentation. So I spoke a lot about the error in the pressure force, but obviously if you have some a slip velocity on your body, your viscous force might also be very, very bad. But for the system, the type of system we're interested in, the viscous force is usually not the main contribution. So we mostly focus on the pressure force for now. And finally, we saw that especially for these thin dynamic surfaces, the treatment of the pressure boundary condition is extremely important. And this is true for all the systems that are pressure dominated, where you want to recover the correct pressure force to get the main forces on your body correctly. I want now to thank you for your attention, and if you have any question, I'm available during Sunday's session at 3:55 p.m. Chicago time. Thank you.